Once again, a very warm good afternoon to everyone. We apologize for the couple of minutes delay in starting the session. I welcome Dr. Prasenjit for today's lecture, and we're extremely grateful to him for agreeing to give this lecture and for sharing his time with us today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Prasenjit and today's speaker. He is an associate professor of philosophy at the Northeastern Hill University, Mehu, Shillong. His specializations include phenomenology, continental philosophy, philosophy of mind, social theory, postmodernism and post-structuralism, global justice, and political philosophy. His prior teaching assignments have been at the Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai and Guwahati, the Indian School of Mines, Dhanbad, Vishwabharati, Shantiniketan, and others. In 2005, he had joined the Northeastern Hill University's philosophy department as a reader, and today he is an associate professor in the same university. During the course of his doctoral work, he was awarded with the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Scholarship, as well as the Teacher Study Grant Fellowship twice by the American Studies Research Center at Hyderabad. Some of his book publications include The Postmodern Controversy, Understanding Richard Rorty, Jacques Derrida, Jürgen Habermas and Jürgen Habermas, Meaning, Metaphor, and Method of Peace in Northeast India, Northeast India, Essays of Concern and Commitment, as well as Ethnic Life Worlds in Northeast India and Analysis. There are several others, but with this brief introduction, it is my immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Prasenjit for today's lecture, and over to you, sir.
Sir, you're muted. Kindly unmute yourself.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. And it is very interesting that once again, maybe after a year or so, I'm able to speak to you. And the theme as it is, is something that relates to the central concern of phenomenology and consciousness studies, which is the idea of self. And that is one central concern in this lecture that I want to flag. Roughly in next 45 or 50 minutes, I'm going to flesh out this idea of self, that I think is important for our understanding of the relationship between consciousness, self, and world. If we look at how the self is imbricated, how the self is embedded, we have to embed self both in consciousness as well as in the world, and we cannot give up one for the other. Now, what Descartes did long time back is to consider self as embodied, or something like what Hilary Putnam once called as envetted, as if self is located in certain part of the body, especially in the brain, let's say, for Descartes. And it is brain which is a certain kind of a devilish machine that produces images, impressions, and ideas of the world. And therefore, self as a concept, for Descartes, it's something which is rooted, which is situated, and which is also embodied in a definite body, but the way it is embedded in a definite body, that also is a source of a disjunction between, the body itself and what the self does in its functions or in its activities. The functional and the activity part of self connects to something which is a more abstract notion of mind, a domain of intuition, imagination, concepts, and also a variety of abstractions, which can be neatly separated, as if separated by an Occam's razor, from the body in which the self is situated. So therefore, there are these kind of attempts in which self is situated only to be cut off from its variety of connections. The variety of connections through which self sort of expresses itself, or the self realizes itself, are all disconnected, are all in a sense disfigured when self is situated in an embedded manner in the brain. Okay, now that is a kind of methodological intervention, and this kind of a methodological intervention keeps self to itself, which is something that passes in the name of solipsism. There's a solipsistic kind of realization of the presence of the self, in which the self can represent something in its own mind, and even the self can claim knowledge about its own mind. So therefore, self is somewhat like a monad, like a complete formation, which is situated somewhere and which has this autonomy of creating ideas, of relating itself to itself. And that's how Descartes would conceptualize the notion of self, which is somewhat disfigured, disconnected, and even somewhat disjointed, from the connections that the self has around the body or outside the body. All kinds of connections are, in a sense, disinterred in this notion of self. Now, in contrast to that kind of a notion of the self, Cartesian notion of the self, which is challenged by, let's say, phenomenologists, because phenomenologists have thought that the self is not really a homogeneous kind of a notion. Self is not one kind of stuff, but self is constituted by, on the one hand, consciousness. On the other hand, the physical process that underlies the consciousness. And on the other hand, a conscious connection with anything other than the self, which can include the world as such, And therefore, the self is constituted in a certain way. And the constitution of the self cannot be disinterred into a unitary, singular, and closed notion of self, as it is in the case of Descartes. So self has to be opened up to the world, self has to be opened up to the body, self has to be opened up to the physical as well as the mental. So the self cannot be situated in some fixed coordinates. The coordinates of the self would be something varying. It's varying across the situation. It's varying across the context. And therefore, one cannot assume a kind of a singular unitary content, to the notion of the self. And therefore, phenomenologists, like Husserl, have thought about self in terms of its constitution, in terms of the elements that constitute the self, And self is constituted by, for Husserl, is constituted by its quality of, or its capacity of, experiencing what? It could be an experience about the world, or it could be an experience which is just connected to what is known to be the experience, the first person experience. So therefore, the self can have constitutively first person experience. It can also have an ongoing act of experiencing, which is an ongoing act of connecting itself to another self, to a second person, or to a third person, in which self is connected to all those constitutive elements which are not self, which are other than the self. So you can see a kind of a level of description, a level of description in which self is in the first personal mode. That's one kind of description. A self could be in the second personal mode. A self could be in the third personal mode. And you can also have a self which supervenes on, something that is not connected to self at all. That's also possible. A self which derives its own power, its own identity from something, which is not self at all, which is an entity or a being, or something like a moment, of understanding, which is not exactly what the self as an agent has done for itself. So the notion of self then becomes wide open. At one level, self is constituted by certain elements, but we cannot really count and say that these finite elements have constituted the self. Although, we like to believe in a certain kind of finitude of the self, but finitude of the self is mapped against something that is not countable, something that is infinite. So the self is simultaneously an experience of finitude, and at the same time, that finite experience cannot really account for the infinite kind of connections that self can develop around itself. And therefore, this creates a very, very interesting situation. Some of the philosophers would say that, the self is only a phenomenal entity, only phenomenal. Phenomenal in the sense that the way the self experiences itself as a phenomenon, So a self experiencing itself as a phenomenon, and that self is enmeshed into the act of experiencing itself. It's not outside, or it's not at the back of it, or it's not in the foreground of it, but a self which is sort of engaged in experiencing itself in a certain way. So the experiencing self, it's not a kind of a proto-self, or it's not a kind of a fixed self, or it's not a kind of a stable self which is available for inspection, introspection, or examination, but a self which is an emerging self, a self which remains emerging, in its own acts of experiencing. So that kind of self does not really assume a fixed perspective on itself. It also doesn't have much of ownership attached to it, but it's a kind of an open disposition. It's a disposition towards itself, and this kind of a disposition towards itself is named as a certain kind of an intentionality. When the consciousness itself is directed towards, a notion of self, or consciousness being directed to the notion of self constructs an idea of self. It's that kind of intentionality. So the non-intentional, the non-described, the substantial, and also something that is assumed to be perennially existing kind of self, located in a certain body, or located in a certain part of the body. You don't really have that kind of a stable self which can preside over a certain experience, or which can become a repository of all these experiences. So neither it's a repository nor it's a presiding deity. It's rather emerging in its own enactments of experiencing. And these enactments of experiencing, or these episodes of experiencing, is something that keeps the self open to its constitutive elements. Now, these constitutive elements, are called hetero-phenomenological. They are not singularly phenomenological, as if everything that it does flows from the singular direction of intentionality. Certainly not. The very intentionality through which the self tries to constitute itself is not singular. It is directed to a kind of a many-level descriptive potential. It is directed to many more things. And if we take everything into account, it's like an open field, which can be best understood in terms of being heterophenomenological. So therefore, you do not have a singular phenomenology of the self. What you have is a heterophenomenological constitution of the self. Now, this is the very, very important point that I want to make. But then there is an important debate, When we say that self is heterophenomenological, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to eliminate, self as a subject, and also self as an agent in the world? Are we trying to eliminate certain aspects of the self? If we say that the self is constituted in a heterophenomenological manner, as a kind of an emerging self, as a kind of an emergent form of consciousness or an emerging form of experiencing, by saying so, are we eliminating, the possibility of self as a subject? Or are we also eliminating the possibility of self as an agent in the world? Now, this requires a little bit of an interpretation here. Self as a subject, is something one can easily understand that it's a subject of consciousness, subject of, once again, a situated consciousness, or subject of an embodied consciousness. Or you can extend it further. You can say that the self is a subject of an extended, embodied, enacted, enworlded kind of consciousness. Now, why consciousness is brought into the picture? Consciousness is brought into the picture essentially because, self is something which sort of flip-flops between, something that it is conscious of and something that it is not conscious of. It's a kind of a mediation, or it's a kind of a mediated place between what one is conscious of and what one is unconscious of. It's a mediation generally between the conscious and the unconscious, And therefore, a certain mode of enactment of consciousness in which the self could be a subject. And also, in an unconscious sense, the self also could be a subject, as in Freud or in Lacan. So both the conscious and the unconscious self are subjects, basically. And when we say that the self is a conscious self, it means self is a subject of consciousness. When we say that self is unconscious, then we merely mean that the self is a subject of a set of unconscious or non-conscious activities. Our body can perform, our mind can perform a lot of non-conscious activities, So self could be a subject of these non-conscious activities as well, just as it is subject of conscious activities. And therefore, self can mediate between the conscious and the unconscious, So therefore, self as a phenomenon and as an emergent phenomenon, is open to various conscious processes and various unconscious processes as well. And conscious processes are dependent on, in a sense, in a scientific sense, a certain act of consciousness, depends on a certain correlation with a physical process or with a brain process, And we can identify certain neurons or certain neuronal, combinations as conducive to produce a certain kind of consciousness. It's possible to correlate a certain neural network and a certain conscious act. And therefore, one can say that the self is causally constituted in this connection between the conscious act and the neural substratum which is behind those conscious acts. Similarly, in the unconscious or non-conscious process of formation of the self, the non-conscious processes are something that goes on, of which the self is not conscious. But at the same time, self or the agency of the self is caught into those non-conscious acts which emanate from a certain kind of physical process or even a certain kind of phenomenal conscious activity on the part of the brain or the body. So therefore, it's possible that the self becomes a subject of the non-conscious, the unconscious processes that go on in and around the body, in and around the brain as well. So therefore, in heterophenomenological terms, this place of the subject, whether this place of the subject is maintainable or it cannot be maintained is an important question, which we'll delve into. The other important question is that whether self as a subject of the world, the world, the way it manifests, the way the world gets connected to existence, and world existence is also often categorized in terms of the situation of a self in the world or in the larger realm of existence, as if self is something existential. The existential character of self, if I put it this way, is connected to an existential phenomenon, a phenomenon which impacts our life and which creates a sense of lived experience in the world. So the question is heterophenomenological constitution of self, whether it is conducive to understand this kind of a status of being a subject of the existential world, or this kind of status of being subject of something that is connected to existence. For example, Heidegger talks about being in the world, Dasein, a being which is out there in the world. A self is supposed to be that being out there in the world. Now, can we identify self in a manner that self becomes a subject in the world? And if self becomes a subject in the world, as we have seen in the scheme of Heidegger, for example, or in the scheme of Husserl, the self has to assume a certain kind of ownership of itself. And when it assumes an ownership of itself, it certifies, it certifies that it knows something about the world. It stands testimony to a certain kind of experiencing of the world or of the existence as such. So therefore, the self has to own itself if it has to become a subject of the world. Now, heterophenomenologically speaking, whether heterophenomenological constitution of the self allows for that kind of structuring or constitution of a subject in the world is an important question. Now, one of the important issue which is raised by Edmund Husserl, is that Husserl propounded, a radical view, of an experienced objectivity, as opposed to the mere conditions of existence. And this is something very interesting. Husserl propounded an experienced objectivity. Now, an experienced objectivity of the self, whether that, takes away the layer of the consciousness or the layer of the unconscious with which, self is assumedly connected, or with which self assumedly is a subject, is an important question. Now, as far as Husserl is concerned, the conditions of existence are such that self has to become a subject. But mere conditions of existence really doesn't constitute the self. Conditions of existence can regulate, the ideation or the location of the self in a certain place. Conditions of existence can do that much. But the experience which is an objective experience of the self, an objective experience of the self has to probably go a step beyond the conditions of existence, And the reason that Husserl gives is that the objective conditions of existence cannot be without the possibility of its excess, and reflection by the subject. Now, conditions such as the possibility of access and reflection by the subject, for Husserl, is something objective. The reflexive character of the subject makes it into an experience which is objective for Husserl. Of course, one can dispute this. One may not entirely agree with it because the degree of sensitivity, and also the kind of limitation that is attached to the notion of objectivity, is not something which makes objectivity into a foolproof concept. Therefore, the experience of an objective self, is also subjectively reflexive. Although the subjectively reflexive self cannot become something like an objective self. So therefore, there is this, once again, bringing back of the, Descartes, where the subjective acts of reflection and the objective experience of the self, do not really go together, although they correspond to each other, but they don't really go together. They remain separated by an ontological split or by a metaphysical split. Now, phenomenologically, the more important question is how phenomenologically the subjective sense of experiencing and the objective sense of experiencing differ radically, as Husserl tries to suggest. Of course, the difference here is that the intended object, which a subjective act of reflection tries to focus on, subjective acts of reflection tries to focus on an intended object, but then can a self-reflexive self, focus on itself instead of focusing on the other aspects of the world in which it is situated? Now, if it just focuses on itself, instead of focusing on all other kinds of connections that the self has with the world, then that kind of reflexivity cannot give you the notion of an objective self. This is what Husserl is trying to say. But can we then have a totally dissociated, detached notion of an objective self? Is an important question. Husserl in Ideas 2 have delved into this question, whether we can have an objective self or not. And in explaining the notion of objective self, Husserl encountered a very interesting phenomenon. The phenomenon that the objective self is an other to itself. It is no longer the same objective self the moment the self experiences itself objectively. An objectively experienced self is an other to, the self itself. Probably he tried to say the subjectively reflexive self cannot be the objectively experienced self, because objectively experienced self has to be different from the self that subjectively reflects on an intended self. So therefore, he maintains this Cartesianism without giving it a foundation, but probably relegating it back to a notion of a pre-reflective state of consciousness. Because in the pre-reflective state of consciousness, as if the self is in a state which is prior to an experience. So a state that is prior to an experience is a certain kind of an original self, which through its own enactments is able to engage with the world or able to engage with itself through its reflection. And by engaging through its reflection, the intended self, through which the entire process now can be experienced, that's a self which is intended, which arises from an original self. Whether that second self that arises from an original self, by way of the experiencing, by way of the act of experiencing, by way of the operation of intentionality, whether that second self, is the objective self. Well, Husserl doesn't commit himself to that kind of a notion of objectivity, because an objective self cannot be a self that is owned by the self. But an objective self must be out there, which is not owned by the self as yet, but which can be experienced as a self, which can be seen, perceived, or conceptualized, but which is not necessarily owned by the experiencing self. So therefore, this kind of an ontological duality, an ontological break, or an ontological bridge that Husserl argues for in his ideas too, is very much there. So this leads us to a situation whereby we can't say that self is a subject, nor we can say that self belongs to the world. Both the positions seem to be correlated, but at the same time not properly supported by a very firm ontological basis. Now this gives rise to several theories. One of the theory that comes to my mind here is that Daniel Dennett talks about a notion of self, which is autonomous. Self is autonomous because it has a free will. Through its own free will, it can assume the role of a subject. It can also assume the role of an object. And these roles, or this variety of roles, which arises from the free will that the self has, takes us beyond self. We don't have to identify the self anymore if we are ready to say that the self has a free will. So how does Dennett identify the free will? Dennett tries to sort of look at the operation of free will in the first person, which is what? Which is acting like a subject, and also acting like an objective self in the first person mode. Free will in the first person mode is both subject and an object. Now, free will in the third person mode, which is something very interesting. It is a certain kind of a causal relationship that is established, between the self and the world, between the self and the events around the self, by way of an intentional act of consciousness, or by way of something that happens, even irrespective of intentionality or no intentionality. So therefore, Dennett thinks that free will can make the impossible possible now. The impossibility of looking at the third personal self from a first person point of view, which seems to be the Cartesian problem in Husserl, is in a sense resolved by Dennett, because in terms of operation of the free will, the self can be in the first person mode. It can also be in the third person mode, where it will assume a kind of a causal network for itself. And this causal network for itself doesn't necessarily require a notion of the self beyond what is evolved, in the sense of a body, or in the sense of an intelligence, or in the sense of something that is functioning as life itself. So therefore, Dennett sort of takes a kind of a leap from the notion of the self, a notion of the self which is divided between a kind of a Cartesian subjectivity and objectivity. From there, Dennett takes a huge leap and goes into the arena of free will, so therefore, if we compare, both Dennett and Husserl, we are not able to decide whether the first personal and the third personal can now be brought together in a unified framework, which this philosopher called Galen Strawson tried to unify the first personal and the third personal in a both. The first personal that involves a Cartesian plate, the third personal that extends itself to the causal networking with the world, whether the first personal and third personal can be unified. There seems to be something missing here, because first personal and third personal doesn't really take into account, something very crucial, the second personal. How does one bring the second personal into connecting the first personal and the third personal is an important question. And there, Galen Strawson, brings out a certain kind of a concept of, derived intentionality, an intentionality which is not directed to the world, but an intentionality which is directed to the self, arising from the world, So he reverses this position. He reverses both the first personal and the third personal into something which is second personal in the sense that the intentionality comes from the world, as if the world is another person, which is not constituted by the free will, or which is not constituted by the intentional acts of the self, but something that is independent, which of course is based on this assumption that the world is metaphysically independent, as Galen Strawson would like to maintain. And his notion of real intentionality, an intentionality that is real, in plain and simple terms, it's not causal, it's not something like free will, it's also not something like evolutionary, but it's something that arises from the world and directs itself to the agent, to the first personal or to the third personal. And therefore, world here is a metaphor for the second personal. Why world is a metaphor for the second personal, and what is the personality of the world in Galen Strawson's notion of real intentionality is an important question. And Galen Strawson would answer by saying that there is this kind of an enworlded matrix, There's a matrix of world relationship, a matrix of world relationship, or a matrix of worldly relationship, which cannot be avoided. It cannot be just that the consciousness be confined and get finite and limited by its own operation. But consciousness has to open itself up to the world. And therefore, there's a certain kind of a difference here between the consciousness and the world, because consciousness has to move along the world, and it has to enter into a certain kind of a matrix of relationship with the world, and the matrix of relationship through which the consciousness tries to understand the world. Those relations are not merely embedded. Those relations are not intrinsic. Rather, those relations are somewhat externalizable. Those relations are externalizable, and these externalizable relations with the world forms, something quite similar to that which is heterophenomenological. Here, the world appears as the phenomenon. The phenomenon of this relationship between world and the consciousness, or the self, or the body, or any other such source of imagination, or source of thinking, or source of reasoning. All that is connected to the world, and which has a certain kind of consciousness, is all because the intentionality is derived from the world. It's not something su motu or sui generis, arising from consciousness, as phenomenologists would have thought about. It is all arising from the world. So in a single stroke, Gallen-Strawson dislodges the traditional notion that consciousness is the source of intentionality. The world becomes the source of intentionality. Now, one interesting example that he gives, in real intentionality is that let's think of a cluster of clouds. A cluster of clouds produces, the idea of rain, the idea of harvest, the idea of a water cycle, and also the idea of evaporation. Now, all these ideas that a cluster of cloud can create is intentional, and this intentionality of the rain, this intentionality of the harvest, this intentionality of evaporation, and all such connected phenomena are all derived from, a certain kind of intentional relationship between the world and the self. And such intentional relationship between the world and the self is not something which is embedded in mere consciousness, but it is something very close to, you can say, Heideggerian notion of enframing. And enframing, as you know, that there is a certain revelation of the world, and through that revelation of the world, a certain idea is formed. And that idea, which is formed through a certain revelation of the world in Heidegger, is the enframed idea. In a similar fashion, almost in a similar fashion, Gallen-Strawson, would be saying that the intentionality that is derived from a phenomenon in the world, or if we take world as a total phenomenon, from the totality of the phenomena of the world, it's possible to derive a certain intentionality, and that intentionality can connect itself to, a discerning subject, which can assume, the sense of an agency, and that sense of an agency, that an intentionally oriented subject. Of course, that intentionality is coming from the world. That intentionally oriented subject can embody, and can act as if it is a self. No one knows that exactly when an intentionally acting subject can become a self. But nevertheless, it's an act of becoming which creates a matrix of relationship with the world by way of operation of intentionality that is derived from the world and not really from the self to the world, the other way around. And if we just overturn the notion of first person and third person intentional stance that Dennett had taken, we can arrive at this kind of an enworlded matrix of relationship. Okay. Now, I'm just giving you these examples of heterophenomenological constitution of the self and a variety of interpretation that it has received. I've talked about some of these important interpretations, but more importantly, all these interpretations actually has this kind of a binary opposition, you can say, between consciousness and the world, between self as the self that is ennowned and the self which is not ennowned, which is the other self. So all the time there's this binary opposition. There's a metaphysical tension within the larger framework of phenomenology. Whether the framework of phenomenology can overcome this metaphysical tension is an important question. And we do not have a very, very clear way of overcoming this metaphysical tension between constitutive elements. Although we know that it's a kind of a phenomenological constitution, and it has a certain kind of metaphysical opposition into it. Now, whether this metaphysical opposition is a productive opposition or not is an important question, and this opposition, which we are not able to eliminate, although many theories try to eliminate it. So the best option also could be to keep this opposition into our horizon, keep this opposition in our horizon, and also sort of frame something out of this opposition. So how can you keep this metaphysical opposition in our horizon? Well, one can keep this metaphysical opposition in the form of a description, in the form of a certain kind of an imaginary. When I say imaginary, it would precisely mean that the role of intentionality, the functions of intentionality, whether intentionality goes from here to there, what is the direction of intentionality, what is the orientation of intentionality. As you know, John Searle used to talk about the intentional fit, whether it's a fit between the intentionality and the world, or whether it's a fit from the world to the intentional self. Almost in a similar vein, this kind of a metaphysical opposition that remains at the heart of phenomenology, can only help us. It can help us in narrating, in narrating a certain experience of this very opposition, the experience of this opposition between the self and the world. That could give rise to a philosophical narrative. It can also give rise to a fictional narrative about a variety of experiences that the self might have. And self might have even certain altered state of consciousness. The self might have a certain delusional state of experiencing. A self might also have something like an out-of-body experiencing. In all these varieties of experiencing, modes of which are still being described in literature, much of these acts of experiencing can now be put forth in the form of a narrative as well, a narrative which is something absolutely productive in the sense that a narrative can always help us to understand a certain mode of experiencing. And if we understand a certain mode of experiencing, we understand how the inner elements of a combination of a variety of experiences, of a variety of anticipations, of a variety of things which are grasped and which are ungrasped, a variety of things which are loved and a variety of things which are not to be loved. All these kinds of experiences are something that is either inhibited, or these experiences are also responded to in a certain manner. So you have both the experiencer, and if we name the experiencer as the self, and the context-oriented reflection on the intentional activities of the self, the immediate and the pre-reflective apperception, that the immediate and pre-reflective apperception that the experiencing self can have, and also the kind of interaction that the experiencing self can have with the world, will create a certain kind of fluidity and openness, and this can affect a certain feeling of agency in spite of all the metaphysical oppositions that is embedded in this kind of an experiencing. Now you can think of a certain kind of impairment of the capacities of reception or capacities of response in certain kinds of subjects. In that kind of subject where capacities are impaired, there is a disruption of the flow of intentional movement, which is a certain kind of a this disruption itself, disruption of the intentional flow itself, constitutes a certain core of experience, if it was not disrupted, if it was going in a free flow, in a kind of a spontaneous adjustment, with the world or with the feeling of others, without any disruption of the intentional flow that the experiencing self might have, if there was no disruption, then probably the experience of a certain kind of reflection would not have arisen. But because of disruption, what happens is that we are not able to determine which kind of intentionality fits with which kind of experience. We are not able to capture that, because of the disruption of the intentional flow. And once that kind of disruption happens, how does one articulate the experience? Can we integrate the internal and the external sensory worlds? Is it possible to integrate the internal and the external sensory worlds? And therefore, it's not very clear how really to settle, the difference of interpretation, or even the inability of integrating the internal and the external worlds of the subject because of the disruption of the flow of experience. Now, this kind of a disruption of the intentional flow gives rise to, that's something also very, very interesting, that it gives rise to a certain kind of an effect with an A. It gives rise to an effect in the experiencing mind, or in the disrupted mind, if you like, you can say, and the effect can now be narrated. The narration of the effect of the disruption of intentional flow could actually preserve that kind of experience. So in a sense, the metaphysical opposition that we experience in a phenomenological understanding of self, that can be sort of negotiated by way of producing a narrative, a narrative about the disrupted flow of experience and its inhibitions and its problems and its kind of constraints that is being experienced in the process of that intentional flow. But this again is a certain kind of a dynamic, and this dynamic unfolds, through a variety of associations and also through private emotional states, probably, which cannot be grasped from outside. So there is this disruption of the flow of intentionality that can result into a private mode of experiencing, which is specific to the first person and which could be expressed in the form of a narrative, and how this kind of a narrative builds itself up, So one can say, as I said, that there is this imaginary of relationship with the world. Now, this imaginary of the relationship with the world, is a certain kind of a phenomenon which is, you can say, which is oscillating between fantasy and creativity, and which is a certain kind of a flight and also a certain kind of a return once again. You can see that the metaphysical opposition between the self on the one hand and self as other of itself on the other can give rise to a certain kind of phenomenon of oscillation between fantasy and creativity, between a certain kind of a flight and return, between a certain kind of an owning and a certain kind of othering, But this is a dynamic, that arises from the metaphysical opposition, and that metaphysical opposition keeps flowing through the dynamic of the narrative, and the dynamic of the narrative is a certain kind of an effect which is carried in the very narrative representation of the disrupted flow. How the disrupted flow affects the flow of the narrative can be recorded very interestingly and in a very creative manner in the narrative itself. Now there are some such disrupted individuals and disrupted subjects who refuse to communicate. They live in an emotional void, and probably they are not able to communicate the effect of the kind of disruptions that they experience. Now, in such a case, there are forms of life and experience that cannot be grasped and learned from outside. And in such a case, one has to see how such incommunicado situations can lead to a narrative of sharing, a narrative of connecting as well. And how does one connect to such narratives which do not communicate and which refuses to communicate? Is not merely shadowy, but the shadowy areas of that narrative gives rise to a variety of concepts which by themselves are phenomenological and which are not available unless one undergoes that state of experience of disruption. And that throws up a certain kind of a challenge, to our usual ways of conceptualization. Because conceptualization is largely representational or imitative, representing a disrupted flow of experience which refuses to communicate, would be through a very different, if not very, very extraordinary form of communication, in the form of some new modes of communication, which is hitherto not brought into picture. And therefore, it is possible to create extraordinary narratives, and through such extraordinary narratives, a solitary consciousness, can be transformed into a task of interpretation. And if we are able to transform a solitary consciousness into a task of interpretation, what will happen is that such an interpretation shall endow us, with new forms of spiritual, moral, psychological, or even political experiences, And therefore, the positive side of the argument is that it's not just creation of a sense, but it is a certain kind of unfolding. It's a certain kind of disclosure of a phenomenon, which otherwise would phenomenologically not be available because of the disrupted flow of experience. Now, this disrupted flow of experience can take the form of certain kind of repression of desire. It can also take the form of a problem in identification of the subject of such experience, of the disrupted flow of experience, And therefore, the desire to understand that kind of a disrupted flow of experience, will remain as a kind of a creative task or a creative desire, and a desire to know the desire of the other who is not able to communicate. And therefore, it will not be an easy mirror object kind of relationship in our narrative. Rather, it will be a narrative about a lack or a missing object, a missing object of desire, which is stuck into the failure of communication, or which is inhibited by the disrupted intentional flow between the world and the subject. And therefore, you cannot easily have some kind of an intentional agent with a goal-oriented action, as it is in the case of usual narratives. But one can also think of an usual narrative in this kind of a context, because a person who is emotionally recluse, can connect to certain other persons. And this connection that one builds up, despite being recluse, despite being a certain kind of a certain person pushed to a certain practice of solipsism, yet having a certain kind of connection, one has to look at these peculiar kind of connections in terms of body states, in terms of states of consciousness, and one can try to understand these states as objective states or as states that are underlying, a certain sort of existence. And this can again give rise to a certain kind of theorization of the states of consciousness, which um, can make us understand a certain kind of narrative that emerges from this kind of emotional cornering through the disruption of the intentional communication. And therefore, feelings, actions, and thoughts that are deciphered directly from this kind of a communication will be rated as, or will be treated as, the experience of others. And this experience of others is something second personal, as Galen Strawson would like to say. This second personal experience is not directed from the first person to the second person, but second personal experience is something which derives its intentionality from a certain state of consciousness, from a certain state of description, which can be understood in a creative way, which can be turned into a task of interpretation. And through this kind of a explication or a perceptive interpretation or an imagination of how the other person may be feeling at a certain stage, we can establish a kind of a provisional hypothetical relationship with the other. And that relationship doesn't really tell us the other person is like me, but the other person could just be a kind of a source of imagination. The other person could just play as an analog of my imagination or of my intention to organize the diverse streams of experience that the other person has. And therefore, one cannot say that the second person is exactly like the first person, or the second person is like the third person. But second person could be a mere analog to understand the first person and the third person. And at the same time, the second person can also embed a certain kind of a public experience or the public mode of experiencing, which can be called as a certain kind of a act of showing that the communication of the experience of the other person, is social. And this social experiencing through the communication of the second person, or the communication or communication by the other person, is something that Husserl once called a certain kind of a spiritual objectivity, in his ideas too. And this spiritual objectivity is something which is constituted by the other person. And the other person is obviously placed at a personality of a higher order. And the personality of a higher order and the personalities which are trying to understand this personality of the higher order are engaged in a kind of a mutual understanding, where the horizon of understanding is constituted by the way the other understands a certain experience. And this kind of a constitution of the, or mutual constitution of the horizon in analogous terms, not exactly in reciprocal terms, but in analogous terms, for the sake of understanding, can give rise to a certain collectivity as well. So narrativity, through the disrupted flow of intentionality, may end up giving rise to a certain collectivity, a collectivity which is a new form of collectivity, where experience of the other is shared between me and the other, between me and the third person, and through this kind of an act of sharing, social relations can be reconstructed. And reconstructed forms of social relations are all meant for a better understanding between someone and the second person. So I would like to stop here just by reiterating this point that self as a subject, or self as belonging to the world are rather naive propositions. These propositions do not really take into account the heterophenomenological constitution of the self. And if we take into account heterophenomenological constitution of the self, the game is not between the first person and the third person, but somewhere the second person. A second person with an altered state of consciousness, a second person with a radically different mode of understanding can become the insignia for a combined shared understanding through a variety of narratives, through a variety of communications that are possible by taking into account the kind of experiences that the second person has. And this would give rise to a spark to a narrative possibility, which would really overcome, probably, the binary between the self and the other, the metaphysical opposition that actually creates a lot of analytical problems, in understanding the very notion of the self. I think I'll stop for a while here, and any question, comment, etc., I really love to respond to that. Whosoever is there, Pusha, are you there? You can please.
I'm here, sir. Can you see me now?
Okay. Yeah, sure. I can.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for this really wonderful lecture. I think there are a couple of questions, as you all know. Anyone? I see a couple of questions in the chat box. Anyone?
Yes.
With questions, please do raise your hands, and also do switch on your videos so Dr. Prasenjit will be able to see you. I see one hand up, sir, and I'll just unmute him. And
yeah, Barun. I think Barun. Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this illuminating lecture. My question is concerning, I have two questions.
Yes.
One is that how is the conception of first person and the self of Daniel Dennett differs from the conception of eliminative materialism of Paul Churchland and Patricia Churchland, or even Richard Rorty, where self is, or consciousness is seen as sort of an illusion, and neurophysiological process is seen as the real, and it is seen as folk psychological dispositions.
Right.
And second is that how much of the idea of Galen-Strawson's conception of derived intentionality, which is not directed to the world, but directed to itself and sort of derived from the world, is corresponds with his conception of panpsychism, where matter is seen as embedded with consciousness.
Correct.
Or matter entails consciousness.
Sure.
Thank you.
And Barun, I'm happy that you have read through the literature. That's very, very interesting. But point here is that, as per your first question is concerned on the first person, Dennett doesn't situate the first person in the intentional acts of consciousness. That is his difference with Husserl. And you have asked me about Strawson. Sorry. Dennett situates, let me go to Dennett also a little bit. Dennett situates the first person in the intentional stance, which is more a kind of abstract materialism, or more a kind of abstract particularism about a variety of things with which the acts of intentionality can connect itself for Dennett. So Dennett maintains a certain kind of connection between the intentional acts and the world, But Strawson doesn't really want to make it that way. Strawson would say that the intentional act itself is something which is in the world. It's no longer in the self. It arises from a variety of things and objects of the world. And from these things and objects of the world, it is directed at someone who is conscious. It can be directed to a bacteria. It can be directed to any other form of life for Galen-Strawson. And therefore, what happens to the first person? The first person is just one end of, where that intentional act is directed. That person is not embodied. That person is not a consciously identifiable and defined person. But that person is just one end of the directed consciousness, which goes from world to the person. And how does it go from the world? It goes from the world because of the peculiar constitution of a variety of things in the world. How those things are constituted. It is the nature of those things, which he calls as real, which gives rise to intentionality and which reaches up to a person. It may be a bacteria, it may be a machine, it may be something else. It is not a kind of a human person. He refutes anthropomorphism or species-centric understanding of intentional acts of consciousness. Therefore, he keeps the field open, to understand how this derived intentionality can now give us a picture of how the consciousness works. So that's how he goes about. Now, this is not an elimination of the person, as people who believe in anomalous monism, such as Donald Davidson at one stage, Patricia and the other Charsland, and Rorty. Rorty, of course, says that self is something like misconception. It's a kind of a linguistic fiction. Why it's a linguistic fiction? Because language requires a person to move forward in language. It is the very nature of representation which is there in a language that constructs the idea of a person. And that person is not a physical person for Rorty, but that person is just a figment of imagination. So this person cannot be more than a physical process or a bodily process, although this person is not equal to the physical process. Rorty will maintain this anomaly between the construction of a fictional person who is a real person, but at the same time, the real person is not the real physical process. There's this slight anomalous monism that you can see even in Rorty. So therefore, Rorty doesn't believe in a perfect eliminationism. Rorty rather believes in a certain kind of a weak correlationism and weak compatibility between a kind of a linguistically constructed notion of person and the physical processes that are supposed to be behind, the working of that person and its consciousness in language, especially in language, not outside language. In language, you have this correlationism. In language, you have this compatibilism. But outside language, there is no person. Outside language, the person is eliminated in Rorty. But as far as Charsland is concerned, you see, the person emerges after a lot of electro-psychophysical processes. All the work of consciousness, is in terms of neural correlates of consciousness. It's in terms of a variety of physical and chemical processes, which is utterly reductive. And being reductive, it can also practice a certain kind of eliminationism. But these are, you can say, the problems in theoretical enframing or theoretical frames. These are problems embedded in theoretical frames. Now, how do you get out of it? That's the question. Probably one way is to create the narrative, a narrative that you can construct after experiencing such a problem. And the narrative can be an extremely creative one, provided it involves certain persons who are apparently not part of the normal understanding of person, but who has something special or who lacks something. If you can choose that kind of a persona, then probably a better narrative can be put forth. And that is where narrativity takes over, the problems that are emerging from the theoretical framing of the idea of the first person or second person. Now, Galen-Strawson strangely comes back to something like panpsychism, where every object has, if every object can give rise to intentionality, so every object is somewhat like a living consciousness. It's a kind of an analogy. Panpsychism is a certain kind of analogy that Galen-Strawson uses in his real intentionality. Panpsychism doesn't really lead to, a comprehensive total theory of consciousness. The hard problem remains there. Hard problems of intentionality, as David Chalmers will be talking about, would remain in panpsychology. Panpsychology doesn't eliminate the hard problem at all, even in balance.
And it also has its own problem of combination problem. And
absolutely, you cannot really have a rule of combination. Although you can see the combination of phenomenon, combination of the substates and the states, but you cannot have a rule about it. That's the problem. You cannot have a computational rule of combination. Yeah.
How do you also perceive something like?
Give other people.
Just a small
chance.
question.
Okay, very briefly. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
just a small. So how do you perceive something like neurophenomenology of
I mean,
France?
neurophenomenology is heterophenomenological. You do not have a neural self, So without a neural self, what you have is only an ambience which can result into multiple connections. And these connections need to be explored, okay? To be very brief and precise with you, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Can we just have a quick couple of questions, sir, and could you just like answer them together in the end, sir, if that would be
Sure.
okay?
Please, yeah.
Sure. Narasimhamurthy, I see your hand up, so please, yeah, go ahead and ask your question, sir.
Sure, please.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, like you were talking about like these heterophenomenological constraints of self. Like I assume like one of the constraints is varieties of experiences.
Yes.
And like what other constraints can we think of like when it comes to like, because heterophenomenological other than varieties of experiences, what are the other constraints of the self? This is my question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of questions in the chat box.
Please.
I'll read them out to you now, and
Sure, please, you can ask another question. I'll answer Norshima later.
okay, sir.
Yeah.
So the first one is, can we say that the conscious self emerges from the unconscious processes of which it is a part?
Yes.
And then there's one fragment of a question I don't fully understand. I think it means self that is not able to, or the self that does not want to.
Okay.
I'm not sure what context. Another question is, can the communication of disruption be in the third person,
Yes.
imagined and abstract?
Yes. Good.
And
I think I take these two questions, Pushya, together. These
sure,
three.
please, sir.
Okay.
Please.
So first to Narshima, what are the other constraints of the self? The most important constraint is to understand the first person experience from outside. Can someone understand the first person experience of a human subject or any other kind of subject? And especially when the first person subject is not able to communicate and emotionally disrupted or is experiencing an altered state of consciousness. This is one major constraint to understand the first person states of another person. The second important constraint is to understand the second person. Now, understanding the second personal communication is always through a narrative or through a certain kind of an external description. Now, to what extent these descriptions are authentic, is an important question. So there's no way to resolve this kind of a dilemma except saying that we engage ourselves in a narrative, in a kind of a conversation. And that conversation will somehow bring together a variety of experiences without meshing them into one single framework. And that remains also as a constraint, that we are not able to arrive at a common, single, consensual, unified framework. Rather, we diverge through a variety of experiences, we too diverge to a variety of thematic, a variety of narratives. And probably that's what we also call as creativity. Okay, so that's the brief answer to Narashima. The second set of questions is unconscious or non-conscious processes, which are not entirely physical, but which is a combination of the physical as well as something that involves a certain part of consciousness. So non-conscious or unconscious is not entirely unconscious. It involves some amount of consciousness and something that is physical. And by combining the two, it creates a sense of a process, a sense of a process which underlies, a certain experience of the world. And therefore, unconscious processes can assume a separate ontology, just as conscious processes can assume a separate ontology. And self can emerge somewhere, both in the conscious as well as in the unconscious, and also in a combination between the conscious and the unconscious. The self can emerge. Self can emerge as a center of consciousness, as a center of taking a certain kind of a perspective on the conscious process or the unconscious process. Okay. Then the second question is a little bit of a riddle. Self which is not able to, does not want to. Yes, one way one can use a certain kind of a negative characterization of the self. But negative characterization of the self cannot be supplemented necessarily by a positive, opposite of it, which can say self is able because it wants to be able, So the idea of want or desire, that is always something which is not necessarily goal directed, because desire, or the large part of desire, remains unfulfilled or unachievable. And therefore, desire remains as desire, if it is to be called as desire. But a large part of desire remains permanently unfulfilled, unachievable. So therefore, doing and wanting, between the two, there is also a certain kind of a gap or an aporia which cannot be filled up so very easily by straightening them up. Now, communication of a disrupted process, that requires a certain kind of imagination. One has to imagine that after disruption, how one is affected. And if one can imagine how one is affected, it is possible to reconstruct, to build up a certain narrative out of that experience of disruption. What I'm exploring is the possibility of reconstructing, by use of narrative, the disrupted domain of experience, so that a certain kind of a communication is possible with the self that experiences a certain kind of disruption. Okay, and that is worked out in various ways in phenomenological psychopathology, in phenomenological counseling, in various ways it can be worked out. Okay, so Pusha, next question. Yeah.
Sir, I think there was one last question. So, can the narrative involve some element of imagination?
Yes, of course. I mean, without imagination, narrative is not about the facts, but narrative is more about describing the facts. And when facts are described, there's a play of language. And the play of language involves a play of interpretation. The interpreter, who is a subject, who is a writer, and the subject of interpretation, and the world, all these come into a certain kind of a play. And it is this play of interpretation which will steer a certain kind of imagination in the readers, in the receivers, which is also another act of interpretation by them. And therefore, you do not have a fixed locus of interpretation, which gives rise to a text which is binding on an act of interpretation. Rather, everything becomes a little bit in a state of flow, in a state of fluidity. And therefore, narrative will definitely propel imagination, and imagination shall in turn propel the pace of the narrative to a different direction altogether. Okay, so this is a very dynamic relationship between narrativity and imagination. Yeah.
So there's another question. I'll just, yeah, please go ahead.
Mohesh, yeah.
Thank you, sir. I just have one question coming from Ayurveda background.
Sure,
and then you talked about Western philosophy. So my question is, the understanding of self in Ayurveda is separated from the physical body. So the neurology and other aspects are not part of it. And the other question was the objective and subjective self. And what we have learned is the ego, which separates from the objective and subjective self. So I just want to know what's your thoughts.
The first thing will be that self has to be understood in a more holistic sense. If you are talking of Ayurveda, so self as a center of consciousness certainly assumes a very special place, which is different from other things in the world, which is also different from the bodily processes. But we can see experimentally that the bodily process, or sharing of experiences with someone else, or a certain kind of experience of the world, all that affects the self. There's an effect. So self has to be understood in terms of an effect, in the Western context, as we understand. And if you understand it as an effect, then you can see that a variety of effects are possible, and corresponding to a variety of effects, a variety of self-understanding is also possible. And each of these selves, or each of these selves, can be connected to a certain physical process, or a certain experience, or a certain activity, in a very creative and ingenious manner, so that it is not the same self, but it's actually a variety, a multiplicity, a plurality of selves that emerges, from this kind of an effect that the world makes, you can say, on the body, or the body makes on the brain, or the brain makes on the self, or on the consciousness. So you have these layers of effect, which is very, very important here. That's the that's how we will look at it. And the second, again, can you repeat the second part that I've just missed? Second thing, Mahesh.
Yeah. So the second thing is in we understand that what separates between the subjective
Yes,
self
ego.
and the
I
objective
remember now.
ego.
Now,
Yeah.
ego is again, it's a very circular kind of an understanding. What is ego? Ego is a certain notion of self that the self itself has. It's self's own notion of itself, and that is what is ego. Now, ego cannot be bound by, a certain arbitrary boundary that the self draws around itself in terms of its body, or in terms of limits of its consciousness. Okay, so ego is actually a certain experience of binding oneself, to a particular notion of self. Now, if we can give up that kind of a bounded notion of ego, then what happens? The objective self can remain somewhere, and subjective self can also remain somewhere, and there could be an interplay between the two as well. So therefore, ego is not something that is essential, in phenomenology. One should not take it to be essential. It is a kind of a property of the self, but it may be a very shifting, altering, changing, transforming property, which can connect the self to a variety of things in the world, and which can probably reconnect the relationship between the subjective and the objective. Okay, Mahesh. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I see one hand up, Priya, and we'll conclude with this question.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask you, since I know your work a little bit, that how does, because you're also talking here about psychosis, kind of psychopathology, how would you sort of work out a human rights problem for the thing that we say in law, insanity, right? It is a big debate that, laws of sectioning are framed around it, that should a person be institutionalized, without their will? Are they in a position to say that they have a will? Are they human in that sense? So how do you sort of see through
because
debate?
you also are aware of the standard protocols of dealing with the human rights of psychopathological people. And in terms of human rights, their dignity has to be re-established and reaffirmed. And in order to reaffirm their dignity, they are not to be subjected to a degenerating kind of a treatment, and they are to be brought into a certain kind of a shared sense of subjectivity by way of establishing a more empathic relationship, by creating a greater degree of sensibility and empathy towards them, which is the work of the human rights, and which is ensured by, the kind of protocols or the kind of legal instruments that we can create in a collaborative sense. So all these instruments can be of great help to recreate a sense of human, with a greater sense of dignity in a psychopathological case, if I say. And you must have come across what we call as therapies, therapies that are created in a creative way for people who have been tortured, or whose testimonies of tortures and testimonies of degradation of human rights are discussed in the open, and they are given a certain kind of legitimacy, a greater legitimacy through, or certain kind of an honor, through their own testimonies, which is called as testimonial therapy, which becomes a very important form of psychological counseling of the tortured or those people who are brutalized, So there are these kind of works that really support a phenomenological understanding of a disrupted self, which can be, utilized for the purpose of building up very sensible handling of, these kind of people who have suffered. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prasenjit, for patiently answering so interestingly all these queries, and also for taking the time off, sir, to address us today, and for the lecture that you have delivered for us, and for opening our horizons of knowledge and understanding of the self. Thank you so much, sir, on behalf of myself personally, on behalf of Team NIAS, and on behalf of the participants whom I think have all enjoyed this course and engaged with it. This lecture and engaged with it through this 1.5 hours. Thanks a lot, sir.
Welcome. You are most welcome. And I really feel obliged that all of you have listened to me so patiently. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Just a couple of, before we all log out, a couple of things before I deliver the formal vote of thanks. Unfortunately, for the next week, we have just come to know, I came to know actually a couple of hours before today's lecture, that the next speaker has unfortunately come down with COVID, and will therefore be unable to address us next week, and we sincerely pray that he gets better, and since that is, of course, primary goal. And we'll see whether it'll be possible for him to maybe address us later in a later lecture, or whether worst case we will have to cancel next week's lecture. So that's just a heads up to everyone. And yeah, let's all send our wishes to him for a speedy and safe recovery. So yes, and lastly, for a quick vote of thanks, I thank first and foremost Dr. Saurabh for making it possible for us to listen to Dr. Prasenjit for this lecture. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks to the Dean and Head of the Consciousness Studies Program, Professor Sangeeta Menon, for conceptualizing and facilitating this course. Thanks to Niharika and Abhishek, my colleagues, who have helped a lot with the Zoom platform and a lot of the background work. Thanks to Ashwini, Meera, and other CSP colleagues for their constant support and enthusiasm. And thanks to NIAS for this wonderful platform. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session. We'll definitely update you by today or tomorrow when that will be. Thank you.